All right, great. So, Carolee, can we just start by you explaining a little bit about what is a story frame?
Yes, definitely. So, story frames is a method of analyzing stories. Typically, speech pathologists look at story grammar elements like setting and those types of things. And so, what we do in story frames is we have icons, visual images, and I use language that is a little bit more user friendly for kids, along with visual images. And I have 12 frames or stories that talk about the 12 elements that are existent in almost all stories. So, the beginning of a story starts with the ordinary world and describing the characters and the setting. And then it moves on to the call and response, which is some sort of call to adventure and then a response to that call. And then typically the hero of the story is reluctant to take off on the adventure, whatever adventure the story proposes. And a mentor or a guide is required to come and help them get going on their journey, often bringing gifts to magical hats or flying shoes or whatever to get them going. And then there's a crossing over into the new world. And all of that's the beginning section of the story. And it's divided into 12 frames. The first 4 frames are the beginning, the second 4 frames are the middle, the final 4 frames are the end of the story. And so it's organized in a way that kids who struggle with executive functioning and those types of issues can wrap their minds around the structure of a story. And so, along with using the structure of the story, which in and of itself is very valuable for understanding and comprehending, just to have some format to which to understand something large like a story. Also, we look at vocabulary, sentence building, grammar, writing, and all kinds of other skills. You're muted, Amy.
Sorry, I muted because of the wind. I feel like it's just so distracting. It's like howling outside my window. Sorry. Two things came to mind as I was listening to you talk about it. And the first is, for those of us who are structured literacy proponents and practitioners, one thing that is so resonant for me is this idea of helping students understand that stories follow this structure, that we can take the structure apart into pieces and look at each individual piece, and then that we can also of course put them back together. And so that synthetic and analytic nature of structured literacy instruction in general, right, beginning with just the individual word, is so present, right, in this whole endeavor. And so I just think it's such a brilliant way to help students understand what can be extremely abstract, which is, a story that is several hundred pages or a movie that takes 2 hours to watch. So anyway, that's just more of an observation. But then the next thing I wanted to sort of piggyback on that and just ask, what is it about the story frame format that you think works so well for students?
I think it's because, and it kind of depends on what aspect you want to talk about, because there are a lot of things going on with story frames. And that's why stories are so great as a tool, because we have a context, and teaching anything in a context is better than just here's an isolated skill. Here's a workbook with random sentences, or here's a workbook with random grammar exercises. To take the context of something meaningful, like a story, and use that as the context to address all of these key skills. So we have the macro structure of the story, which is understanding the plot, but then the microstructure elements are, what about the building blocks? What about the vocabulary? What about the syntax? And all of those things that are the building blocks of the story. But if you want to talk about specifically something like writing skills and why story frames is so useful for that, in part what I'm doing, because I'm also an author of fiction, is approaching this from how do authors plot their books. And so that's something that makes this whole process unique. And most of us, or a lot of students, think that authors just sit down and write and this 300 pages just magically appears. And Some writers do write that way, but most of us do need to plot. We've got all our note cards and it's very structured. A lot of research goes on behind it. But when kids understand that structure, then they have something to organize the narrative, and it inspires us because we know what's coming next in the story when we're reading it. And when we're writing, we have a roadmap to use for writing. And so another thing that has to do with writing is the oral language is the foundation on which written language is built. And so there are a lot of opportunities for oral language, for just starting out, listen to the story, and then we're going to retell the story. And that's the basic building block before you even get to writing, is to talk about the story. And now I have the oral language with which to formulate a sentence that I can then write. So there's a lot of talking that goes on, because of my background as a speech pathologist, definitely a lot of the oral language component is built in.
Yeah, that's awesome. And why did you first start doing this with your students? I assume you started doing it with kids you were working with as a speech therapist.
Absolutely.
But what was the initial spark there?
I love writing. I write novels. When my kids were young, I would wake up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. to write novels. And then I would get to school with the kids that I worked with, and they hated writing. They hated reading. And there was this big disconnect between this great passion I had for writing stories and loving reading stories, and the students who struggled so much with the written language. And so I wanted to take the excitement that authors feel and transmit that to my kids. And another interesting tidbit is, it is surprising how many children's authors are dyslexic. There are a large number, and there is also a disconnect between having a really good idea and being a good speller. They almost have nothing in common. And so I believe kids come to school with this love of stories and the ability to tell stories, and then they struggle so much with the writing process that it just kind of shrivels up. And so another inspiration for me, a really great inspiration for me, are the numerous wonderful children's book authors who themselves have struggled a lot, quite a bit, and yet they love stories so much that they somehow overcame that to become writers. And in my last blog in October, I did a whole series on articles about children's authors who have dyslexia, who struggle with the written word. And so it was that passion to know that there is that fire inside, and it is not linked to your skills as a speller. There are, a lot of writers actually will turn off spell check and turn off grammar check while they're writing their first draft. They want to get everything down, and it disrupts the flow of their writing process to have a word popping up in red. This is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. And so they will do their entire first draft turning off those aids. And then, of course, obviously, they go back through and turn them back on and scrutinize everything they write very carefully. But for that first draft, they want to just get the words out on the page. And our students who struggle with writing really struggle with that process of getting anything down on the page.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it oftentimes paralyzes them from being able to write. But I also think that a reason it works is because it provides the structure. I was kind of reflecting on the parallel between providing kids a structure to support their thinking about writing, in the same way that at our school, we often talk about building the container for learning, and that when you provide a structure for learning and you make very explicit what the expectations are, how they're supposed to interact in the classroom, all of the things that for a lot of the children that we work with are initially quite mysterious and that they never really intuited perhaps in the school that they were at before ours. It actually is the first time that they're able to relax So there's freedom within that structure. I feel like there's actually more freedom to have creativity when you know that you're operating within some parameters. Um, maybe it's that there's not an anxiety about like, where is this going or what is expected. You can follow the structure, and then within that you have all the freedom in the world to be creative. So it seems like a paradox, but to me, I think it's the exact same thing we do when we structure our classrooms at our school, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does make sense. That structure is liberating, confining and liberating, and it's liberating in its confinement, in that I know what's coming next. So when I originally was working with story frames, I had a different title for it. It was called The Secret Language of Stories.
Hmm.
And it speaks to what you're talking about in terms of it's a mystery. And so when I was taking writing courses and workshops as a writer, as an author, to uncover these mysteries, the people in the course, of course, would get very excited, because as soon as you talk about a story element, everyone knows what you're talking about, and we've seen these things in movies. And so we start out with story frames, just talking about the story elements, and then what do you already know? You already have this wealth of knowledge, and you don't even know that you have it. And so, for instance, when I was originally learning about story structure as an author, one of my favorite courses that I took was by Christopher Vogler, who wrote The Writer's Journey: Mythic Structure for Writers, which I highly recommend. And I mention it in my book. If you have any interest in being a writer, and I know a lot of you probably do, because there are a lot of very creative teachers. A lot of the people I know who are children's authors were former teachers and librarians. Um, and I used a lot of his ideas, and he got his ideas from Joseph Campbell and The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And so I use a lot of that as the foundation. And so there's something he talks about. It's called the call to adventure, and then he calls it the refusal of the call to adventure. And that's a story element that when you understand it, you'll see it everywhere, and you'll start seeing it and observing it in books you read, and especially in movies. So for instance, there's an invitation to go fight the zombies or whatever, the particular invitation for the story. And then there comes in this refusal. No, oh no, I can't go. I can't go fight the zombies. I promised my wife I would never fight zombies again. And Christopher Vogler calls that the refusal of the call. In Save the Cat, which is a really popular book for novel writing and screenplay writing, a lot of people use it during NaNoWriMo for National Novel Writing Month. He calls this the debate. So there's this debate: should I go? Shouldn't I go? It's too dangerous. And the more dangerous the journey is, the more debate there is. I can't possibly go. I have other responsibilities. And then all of a sudden, they're in the next scene and they're going off to fight the zombies. And it's almost comical as you start to see that. But it's one of those secret languages or mysteries that people who are in the know, authors who have studied plotting, they know that these things are going on. And when kids learn them, then now they're in the know. Now they have this secret knowledge. And you can pull on that to put something fun in your story. And it's exciting to say, oh, I could easily come up with a reason not to go fight the zombies, or not to go on this adventure, or not to, I can build that into my story too. So I call it the call and the response to the call, because sometimes it's a refusal. Often in shorter stories, there's not that much of a debate, and they just take off right away. So I don't go as deeply into that as some plotters and authors of plotting do, but that's just an example.
Yeah, that's great. As I was listening to you talk, I was also thinking about, well, so I have an MFA, and my first novel that I attempted to write before I went into the MFA program really suffered from a lack of structure, big time. I thought I was going to get my MFA to learn that structure. And actually, the program that I was in really de-emphasized structure. to me in kind of a maddening way, because I was like, this is why I'm here, guys. Like, I need this code, right? And it also, as you were talking, it just reminded me of the parallel between, even teaching reading and teaching reading in a way that's intuitive, like if you just expose kids, they're going to learn it, versus actually teaching them a structured code-based approach. And so what would you say to people who would maybe push back a little bit and say, well, kids should just have a topic and write about it, that they should have the opportunity to be free of structure and just, do express themselves?
I would say that that is actually terrifying. And this is, this is the blank page, and this is terrifying to adult writers and to children alike, to stare at a blank page with no idea. And that is interesting what you say about structure. I hadn't really thought about that, but this is a conversation that I have had with writing friends of mine in the past, and that is that these creative writing programs don't teach structure. And if you want to be a novelist selling novels, now if you want to just write beautiful, lovely things that you never publish, then that's fine.
Exactly.
But if you want to be a working novelist, then you really need an understanding of how the structure works, because guess what? The editors and the agents, they're looking for this structure.
And so are the readers.
And the readers are looking for this structure. And if you don't have it, and it's a real disservice in schools of creative writing that don't teach story structure, because when you get out, you're expected to use it, and you're expected to know it. And if you don't, then you're going to have a really difficult time trying to sell that novel, or even write the novel, or even finish a novel. And so what these people end up doing is going to workshops. So the workshops that I'm talking about that authors attend are for the craft of writing. And so they'll go and pay. Now, they may have spent a fortune getting that MFA, but now they'll go pay to get the actual, how does this actually really work?
Yeah.
Which unfortunately a lot of people do in education too. They get a certain level of education, they have to go pay for themselves to now go get, but what am I really practically needing to do to teach reading? And authors are the same. Now I've got my MFA, and I'm not saying that all schools are like this, but there are a fair number of creative writing programs that are. And now I need to go back and get a real education of how this works in the real world. So that was an interesting question.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. And so, there is a great chapter in the book by Paula Moraine about executive functioning skills and how we can support executive function through writing. And so, as we're talking about structure, certainly the executive functioning skills are all about understanding structure, recognizing structure, creating structure organizationally for ourselves, and ultimately self-regulating ourselves through some kind of structure. Hopefully self-imposed eventually versus, imposed by the external forces in the world, although that's sometimes necessary as well. So I'd love if you just talk a little bit about how you see that connection between writing and executive function.
Right. And so Paula Moraine wrote an excellent chapter, as you said, on executive function. And so there are a couple of highlights. She talks about attention, creating mental images, review and preview. And in the section of her chapter where she talks about attention, especially kids who have attention deficits, we have to choose what to focus on. In our classrooms, we have a lot of stimuli. We have a lot of sounds, a lot of visual stimuli. Well, stories have a lot going on too. And so how do we decide which part of the story to focus on? And that's what this structure, this story structure and plot structure helps us to do, is these are the highlights. And so to know, where should my attention focus? So as a speech pathologist, part of what we do when testing students, evaluating students to see if they have receptive or expressive language difficulties, is ask them to retell us a story. And so let's say that a child is telling me about a movie they saw last week. One of two things happens typically. Either they say, I don't know, And even if you say, what was the subject? What was it about? I don't know. Well, was it about a dog or a dinosaur? Uh, a dog. Uh, and they don't have anywhere to go from there. The opposite, which is similar underlying difficulty, but the total opposite response is they will start at the beginning and they will tell you every single thing that happened in the story because once again, they don't have a structure to know what's important, what is more important, what is interesting detail, and what is absolutely essential to the story. And so understanding that structure works with both issues. And then we have to be able to mentally listen to a story or read a story, create a visual image to be able to put that into our memory. And if we have difficulty creating visual images, then we're going to have difficulty remembering. And then another aspect of executive function is just the review and the preview and looking at the whole and then looking at the parts and then putting them back together into the whole again and knowing how to organize that. And all of that has to do with executive function as well.
Definitely. I mean, one of the things when we do professional development with teachers, whether we're working with elementary school teachers who work with real young children or teachers who work with high school age kids, one skill that always comes up is summary writing or summarizing and how do I get my kids to write a summary. And it's all the skills you're just describing and talking about, that for many teachers, they're approaching it, I feel like, from the wrong vantage point. They're not really approaching it oftentimes from a structural standpoint until we make that explicit and say, well, just like you just described in a story, we have to be able to pull out the spine, for lack of a better analogy, but like the spine of what this is actually about, and shed away all of those other details that are vibrant and adding information, but not essential to the story. So I've always spent a lot of time thinking about different ways to teach summarization skills. And anyway, I don't have a question. I'm just commenting on that.
I should have drawn some visuals because so the way that the approach works is we talk about the different elements of the story. And if I can find the page in here, I will. We talk about the different elements of the story and there are icons that go with each element. As the child listens to the story, they have a blank piece of paper and they're taking picture notes, what I call quick draws, stick figures. And then we look at their stick figures and we talk about the story elements and say, okay, which one of these is the ordinary world? Let's redraw that here. Which of your stick figures represents the call to adventure and the response to the call? And let's draw that here. And then and each of these have icons.
And why, Carolee, why do you feel the icon part is important?
Well, it goes to that visual aspect of it. And then those icons actually, there's another sheet that has right now, we remember without having to take notes, without having to write any words, because a lot of kids struggle with that, but we have our picture notes.
Right.
And now we look at this square, this one's our ordinary world, and there's another sheet that has the same icon, write that here.
Yep.
And whether you use my approach or any of my materials at all, I would highly suggest using these icons for everything you do. Any handout, if you can have, which paper is it? And the kid goes dumpster diving into their backpack. Get out your vocabulary worksheet. Well, because they don't have the ability to scan, they may not even be able to read the word vocabulary worksheet. It's like dumpster diving into their backpack or their folder and a lot of time is wasted trying to find that worksheet. Mm-hmm. And so if you pull out the paper that has an umbrella on it or a picture of a whatever on it, then they have that visual and they can quickly organize that information. So basically we have the squares, we have the sketches that they've drawn, and then there's a picture of a world for the ordinary world. Now they go over to this sheet that's the graphic organizer, write 1 to 2 sentences on this in this place. There's a picture of a world here, there's a picture of a world here, write it here. We have a little trumpet for the call to adventure. there's a picture here. Now write 1 to 2 sentences here. And
Yeah.
so it helps to take this huge, like you said, this huge idea and put it on a spine, put it in an organization. And so a student may just be at the level of just telling the story, just using the storyboard, just to point to the pictures and tell the story. That may be the level they're working at. We might want to cut them apart and scramble them and see if they can put them back together to work on sequencing. Or
Mhm.
they can take their storyboard and start to put it onto the worksheet for the story summary. So there's one page for the beginning, another page for the middle, another page for the end. So by the time that they have written all these sentences, they've got, if they've written 1 to 3 sentences for each part of the story, for each section, and the section has 4 blocks, then they'll have 4 to 12 sentences.
Mhm. Yep.
And then they can take that and write a paragraph.
Yeah. I think it's great. First of all, I just think it concretizes it for them so much. It concretizes the abstract concepts, because each of those things, the call to action, the refusal, they're all very abstract when you just talk about them with a lot of blah, blah, blah. But once they see examples of them, first of all, right, in stories that they're familiar with, but then when they see those icons, it's like immediately it takes something that is just abstract language and makes it concrete. I think it works so well. The other thing I was thinking about there is there's a way in which starting with that de-emphasizes all of those things that you were talking about. So it de-emphasizes the mechanics of writing and spelling and all the stuff that a lot of the kids that we work with think they're not good at, and refocuses them on those visual representations, which most of the kids we work with feel better about, and some of them, really feel great about. So I think that's it's a nice way to sort of take them gently into the writing process and emphasize this is about composing ideas, and that all of those mechanical things, yeah, they're important, but we're not worrying about those yet, you know?
Precisely. And I like to do something I call random acts of writing that are just completely random. They're structured from the teacher's or therapist point of view, but the student feels like it's a game. And so there's a slide deck that's called Dicey Stories, where you have 6 choices and you roll the dice and you just pick one. And that's your main character. You roll the dice, you have setting, and you can use the ones I've created, or I've also done this where the kids create 6 choices as a class. Let's come up with 6 choices for a type of character. Let's come up with 6 choices for a type of setting. Let's come up with 6 choices for a type of helper, and 6 choices for a special gift that this helper might give. And so we go through each of those, rolling the dice and picking it. And so it really removes that fear of what if I make the wrong choice?
Yeah.
Because even if with this structure, even with kids knowing, okay, at this point, I need to come up with a special gift for my character, but what if I pick the wrong one?
Yeah.
It could be the wrong special power or the wrong special gift. And so to make it as random as possible, we roll the dice and we pick it. And now you can roll with that, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Forgive the pun. And it just gets those creative juices flowing. We're still following the structure, and it can result in some pretty ridiculous, silly stories. I once did a project like this with a group when I was working at a high school with kids that stay from 18 to 21 because they have pretty extensive needs. And I was doing this with the OT, and the kid who rolled the dice was nonverbal, and he had a device where he rolled the dice, and then whatever, he had a lot of power because whatever the dice rolled, that was what we picked for our story. And we created a pretty ridiculous story. But they were also working on bookbinding as a job skill. They had recently purchased some equipment to be able to bind notebooks and things like that for the school. And so they were able to bind the books and come up with visuals for the books. And even though it was fairly ridiculous, as you can imagine, a year or so after she graduated, I saw one of the girls at Dion's Pizza, and she said, "Do you remember that story we wrote?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "I read it every day."
Oh, oh
So
my goodness. That's a beautiful story.
even these stories that can seem completely silly, sometimes they're the most powerful because we have she felt empowered as a writer.
Right,
I felt
exactly.
empowered as a reader.
Hmm. As I'm listening to you, I'm also thinking about in our May, what we call the May Way writing curriculum, one of the aspects that we use are warm-ups that are all taken from comedy improv games. And I have a theater background, so I grew up doing those things. And since then have read also a lot of research about them, particularly in their use with people on the autism spectrum. And what I have learned, and also what I sort of knew from my own experience with it, resonates with what you're saying here, which is, first of all, they're so useful because we're not invested in the outcome. This is a short game that we're just engaging in and playing with for the moment. So they really enforce that, there is no one right answer in writing, that we don't have to freeze up and worry about making the wrong choice. They encourage our initiation so that we're not just terrified of that blank page. But then all of those communication skills, communicating to others, and of course the rules in improv. So one rule in improv is you can't say no to what another actor gives you. So you have to say yes and. So the idea is, right, you can't reject someone else's idea, but instead you build on their idea. And what I have found is that that's, of course, useful for social skills and pragmatics and all of those kinds of things. But I think it's also a useful skill for yourself as a writer, because so many of the students that we work with will start something. Sorry, my dog is, will start something and then they'll want to abandon it. Right. They won't want to see it through, especially if they hit a roadblock. If something goes not as they had thought, then it's like, okay, I'm just going to start over. And I think one of the beautiful things about improv is that you can say to yourself, all right, I'm not going to say no. Instead, I'm going to say yes and see where this takes me. So
I
made me
love
think.
that. That reminds me of a writing workshop that I attended, and the best piece of advice that I came away with was this man. I can't tell you who he was, what workshop it was, but he said, write on a sticky note, dare to be bad, and put it on your computer, that where you have to look at it every time you sit down to write something, dare to be bad. And it's not just our students who struggle, who have difficulty with this. It is professional writers as well. We just get frozen because we're not willing to just put total junk on the page. But when you put total junk on the page, first of all, it's not always junk, and at least you have something to revise and something to work with. And so that was a little bit of interesting advice. And I do have to say something about my writer friends, because I've been talking a lot about plotting and a lot about the types of workshops I've attended as an author. There is one camp, and we call ourselves plotters or pantsers. And plotters are authors who plot with the cards and the whole outline and everything else. Pantsers sit down and just write by the seat of their pants. Stephen King wrote a book on writing where he says that this is his method for writing. He just writes by the seat of his pants. He doesn't have a plan for where things are going. However, I will say that in my book, Story Frames, I have analyzed 32 children's books. Some of them are written by plotters and some of them are written by pantsers, but I find that structure or that spine in all their stories. And so I would say that those writers who consider themselves pantsers probably have a very strong sense of story structure that is innate, that they naturally, when they're just sitting down and ideas are flowing, they just innately think, okay, what should come next? How about a mentor appears with flying shoes. I think that's what should come next. And they write that. And now what should come next? Well, now I think they should go somewhere. It's not because they're following that structure. It's because the structure is innate. It's not something manufactured. It's something that resonates with us. And when we, like you said, when we see it in stories, a lot of times we go to a movie and we don't even know why we loved it or hated it. And it's because it either does or does not follow these predictable patterns.
Yeah. I mean, makes me think about Chomsky says, that every moment we're telling ourselves the story of our lives, right? That's how we make sense of the world, is that we continue to tell ourselves the story. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about kids who have, pretty severe executive functioning issues is that oftentimes they're not yet able to have that internal dialogue and tell themselves that story. And so everything feels disjointed and disorganized and unpredictable, because they don't yet have that internalized language that allows them to find that spine. Yeah.
Right. And so we need theory of mind to be able to read other people's stories, listen to other people's stories, and take their perspective, consider what are their beliefs, what are their intentions. So theory of mind helps us, this is what I think, you think. But when we're writing a personal story or a personal narrative, we have to take a different sort of perspective, not this other person's perspective, but my perspective on past events.
Yeah.
And so writing a personal story can be very important too, if you just consider how often a personal narrative is used in our daily lives. How many little personal stories have we told in this last 40 minutes together?
Yeah.
Or we come back from summer vacation and we see our colleagues and we say, so how was your summer vacation? Well, let me tell you the story of our trip to the Grand Canyon, or a wedding. It's why if things go badly at a wedding, you've got a really good story. If everything goes perfect, you don't have a great story to tell. So we reflect on our lives, we reflect on our experiences. Lawyers tell stories to try to convince of guilt or innocence, and marketers tell stories to persuade you to buy products. It's such a natural part of our lives. It's not just for academics. It's how we think about our world oftentimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Pamela, I see you have your hand up.
Yes. Hi there. My name is Pamela, and I am not a teacher. I'm a parent, but this year I think I am also a teacher. So anyway, so thank you for welcoming me into this elite group here. So my daughter has surface dyslexia, and I will say she is incredibly imaginative, and the open page I don't actually think is all that intimidating to her. But that's okay for me. And I do a lot of writing. I'm like, I get what you're saying about that. So these tips are good for me as well. Where I'm wondering if you have suggestions is like yesterday, she voluntarily wrote a story, and she is just fast. And I feel like she's running through everything, and you just let her run. You don't critique at all, just let her run. But I'm trying to teach her in a way that doesn't cramp her style. How to, it's grammar. I know grammar is not fun, but like the power of grammar and the power of putting a period here means that this sentence pops. This sentence has then people will really get it. She's in third grade, so she's young. But I don't know if you have suggestions for me on how to, I don't want to be a grammar dictatorial on it, but grammar can also serve a purpose in telling your story even better. So if you have suggestions, I'm open.
So there's a couple of things. I also get the rambling story, and it's interesting because there's a section in my book where I give some examples of, because I find it very interesting that the students I work with dyslexia, because I have a private practice where I work with students with dyslexia on a very specific program, but I try to work in time for stories. Mm-hmm. And I can't do it every day, but often enough. And really interesting to me how many of the students I work with want to be writers. They really struggle with spelling, and they struggle with reading, and they have wonderfully imaginative ideas, and they would love to be writers, and they just come and bring these stories. And so there's a story in the book about a girl who basically brought this story, and then we just we read a book. It was Six Dots, Story of Young Louis Braille, and we talked about the structure of the story. And then next time I saw her, she came with a very different story. And she had internalized, I mean, not just internalized it, we had done the sketches and talked about each part, talked about all the story elements, and then she started using that in her story, and then came up with a story that was much more organized, because kids, when they write, if they love writing, they kind of go off on these tangents that could be like the never-ending story. And so that's one of the things I hear you talking about is how do we get just that structure of a story that makes sense?
And I would say she has the structure, like there's the beginning and the middle and the end, and it's not like, why are we looping around here? It can be a big run-on sentence. So
you just want to know how to work with that. And since I think that since she loves writing stories, using that to work with grammar is going to be much more effective than here's a bunch of grammar exercises. Here's a grammar book. We're taking your story and we're working with grammar with your story. And so there's a chapter by William Van Cleve, because he is much better with grammar than I am, that gives a lot of tips for specifically working with grammar. But I think using that story as the substance, but what I also hear you saying is you don't want to be the taskmaster with this fun project. But you can use the fun project to say, okay, let's look at that, and and now let's work with the grammar, and there's more there's a real reason to work with the grammar, because she does want it to be the best story possible.
And I'll just add to that, because I think one of the most important things that Van Cleve says, in my opinion, in that chapter, and something that I also believe as a teacher, is that the most classrooms will spend a lot of time with students identifying the parts of speech in someone else's writing, right? So they're given sentences and they're supposed to label the nouns and the verbs and all that. But not enough spend time teaching kids that we can use those parts of speech to say what we want to say, to construct meaning, right? That's a powerful tool that we have. And so one of the things that we do at our school, first of all, is that we only look at one thing at a time. So the first draft, as Carolee's saying, we just let it flow and we don't worry about any of those mechanical things, because our students with dyslexia often have a relative weakness in their working memory. So they can only really hold, if they're thinking about their story, we want all the space there taken up by that story because it's awesome and they're excited about it. So we want to really feed that. But then what I would do is I would have her go back in and I would maybe read her, like, let's say it's a run-on sentence, right? So I would have her read that sentence out loud. And then I would say to her, okay, so is that saying what you want it to say right now? Or would it be stronger if it were actually two separate sentences? So what you want to direct her towards is, because she seems like she has a very strong semantic brain. She wants to convey her meaning. So by using her own writing, you can play around. You can say, well, let me read it to you this way. And then you could read, like, put a period where it doesn't go, right? And read it to her like that. And then, is that what you mean? So, I think it's important to engage her in that process as a discriminating editor, but recognizing that it's going to be most successful when you just ask her to focus and hold in her working memory one thing at a time. So when it's composition, let's run with the composition, and then let's look at one grammatical thing at a time. So I would only, like, I hate the, which is what I used to do when I was an English teacher for like 10 years before I knew better. I'd go through kids' drafts and I'd mark them all up with a red pen. I didn't usually use a red pen, but still, I'd mark them all up, every single thing, the misspellings, the run-on sentences, the capital letters, all that. And then the kid would turn it back in and they'd get maybe less than half of what I had corrected. And I would be so irritated, right? Well, what I realize now is that was a pointless exercise. What were they actually learning? But if I took it one thing at a time and I said to them, we're just focusing on making sure that we have complete sentences. We're just focusing now on, do we have all the capital letters in the right place? So one at a time, I think you'll find it's less frustrating for her and for you, but that it might actually result in a process that she feels more ownership of, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could totally see that resonating with her. Thank you. That's very helpful, both of you. Thank you for that.
And so in the book, there's actually a toolbox for editing. It's an editing toolbox. And just going off of what Amy said, there's one thing. So there might be a hammer, and on the hammer you put check for capitals and periods. And then there might be a wrench, and the wrench would say, make sure everything is in the same tense, either all in past tense or all in present. Doesn't matter which one you pick, but you have to stick with one. And then a screwdriver, and there's a tool that says add describing words. And like you do one, you only do one at a time. And this is the way that authors work as well, going through to look for the timeline. And then an author might go back through and look for grammar and punctuation, and then go back through. And if you you repeat a certain word, just look for that word throughout your manuscript. And so that's the way that professional writers work. But I wanted to show you one of the diagrams. Now this is the who, what, where, why questions. And these have icons as well. And all these icons, a lot of them come from the Noun Project. And for a small fee, and if you're an educator, it's very inexpensive, you can put in any word and get these icons. It's great for vocabulary building and abstract words. But who, basic building blocks of a sentence, who or what is the subject and what are they doing? And that can be a complete sentence. But then we can also say, where are they doing it? And when and why, and add this and keep building it. It's still only one sentence, because we are still just talking about who or what is the subject and what are they doing. And so there's also that visual representation of how to build sentences like that, which helps with our comprehension and understanding, but also with our syntax. And as we understand and create more complex sentences, we also understand them when we read them and come across them as well. So that's another way to look at, is this a sentence? Because a sentence can be 2 words, or it can be half a page long. But that's something more concrete if you want to look at building sentences in that way too, as well.
Yeah, that could be a fun way to do it also. And again, using their words, not some other words.
Yes, yes. I also use that to talk with kids about book illustrations. Who or what is the subject of this picture? What are they doing? Where are they doing it? When is it happening? Why? Why is it happening? Why are they doing it? And so again, building that oral language as the foundation for written language.
I'm going to pause because we're coming up close to 7 o'clock. Does anyone else have questions?
Hey, Carolee, this is Stephen. So the state of New Mexico, I'll take it to the state level. That was a really interesting discussion about writing, and I almost wish I was back in the classroom so I could try some of those strategies. But the state of New Mexico has codified into law structured literacy as an approach. But we know that typically what we do in public education is we compartmentalize reading, and then we talk about writing, and then we talk about the arts, and then we talk about this, and then we talk about numeracy, as opposed to looking at it rather holistically. And what I heard you say at the beginning of your discussion was this is an integral part into what we should be doing in the classroom, not disconnected as a separate today. Now we're going to do writing. And then in the next half hour, we're going to do reading. And then we're going to do, mathematics. So Amy, this is a good question for you as well. How comprehensive is our statewide literacy plan to include these components that are so essential to educating the whole child and making sure the kids have multiple opportunities to express themselves and find meaning in what they're doing outside of just the reading or the writing?
Yeah.
Are we there yet, or do we need to do more with that?
Yes, the answer is yes, we need to do more. It's been very interesting to me. So what Stephen's referring to is we have a statewide initiative right now to focus on structured literacy in all of our classrooms. And it's really just been 1 year that we've been doing this, but we have a working committee that is working on it and working with the PED. And what I'm seeing so much and what I hear all the time just reinforces what you just said, which is that so many educators really have pretty deep assumptions about the fact that reading and writing are separate things. And even though in the structured literacy, the course that May Center created, that's on the PED website, in all of the programs that you look at that are structured literacy programs, true structured literacy programs, writing is an essential component of all of these. And yet I have heard people all the time, including, people in leadership roles say, well, but what about the writing? Well, it isn't just all about reading, it's also about writing. Sometimes you'll hear people argue that as a reason why structured literacy is not, it shouldn't only be a structured literacy approach, right? Whereas, of course, what we know is that writing, decoding and encoding are two sides of the same coin, and that writing is integral. It's the ultimate goal of structured literacy is semantics. It's making meaning. And so that's both comprehension and composition. So I think in education for a very long time, the thinking about that has been siloed. And it's going to take a long time to change. That's my 2 cents. I don't know, Carolee, if you want to add to that or disagree.
Well, my mind sort of spun off in a little bit different direction, and that's adding in even more, like the social studies and the math and the science. And I forgot to mention that one of the key elements that I focused on was choosing books that are narrative nonfiction, meaning they follow a narrative structure, but they're about real people. Now, not all of the 32 books that I analyze are, but a large percentage of them are narrative nonfiction picture books, which include a real person. There's 6 dots in the story of young Louis Braille, who created the Braille writing system when he was 15. And so it's a compelling, wonderful story, but it's about a real person. It's historical. It's also about a person with a disability. So we're also getting the grit and the emotional piece. And I just realized that I had a bunch of questions to ask you about your chapter, because your chapter is about grit and perseverance. And we have like 3 minutes left. And I really wanted to talk to you about your superhero stories.
We could talk for like 5 minutes.
I'll
give you like 5 minutes.
So I just did an interview with a very interesting author. Her name is Lynn Miller Lockman. She wrote a book called Rogue. The main character has Asperger's syndrome. The author has Asperger's as well. And so that is going to appear on Sunday on my blog. But it made me, and Rogue is the X-Men character who can't be touched and can't touch other people. And so she used this superhero component to work through her own trying to explain her experiences with Asperger's. And so it made me think about your chapter and how you use the superhero stories with your students.
Yeah, that was really that was the kids that really initiated that, because as I say at the beginning of the chapter, I was not a big superhero fan when I was a kid. I really liked Spider-Man, but mostly I liked Spider-Man because of the visuals associated with Spider-Man. I didn't really internalize the stories, which was so interesting because I internalized every other story. But when we started Dyslexia Justice League, which is an advocacy group for students with learning differences all across the state of New Mexico, the first thing we did was we had a gathering, and we asked the kids to define the organization. And so they were the ones, first of all, that came up with the name of the organization. They came up with the visuals, with a logo that was a superhero. They loved the notion that they had heard that phrase, dyslexia is my superpower, and they really loved that. And so they really brought the superheroes to the table. And then the more that I started thinking about it, and I had the opportunity to talk a bit with someone here who is a big superhero fanatic who runs a comic shop here in town. I really I recognized that superheroes face adversity and overcome that adversity. And in fact, it's often the source, their adversity is the source of their superpower. So that just resonated so nicely to me, so deeply with my experience with working with kids with learning differences. That, when you work with kids who have learning differences, there's a whole journey of acceptance that really not just the child, but also the whole family goes through. And it starts oftentimes with a denial. It often starts with the family not really wanting to know what's going on and thinking that maybe the child will grow out of it. And, just all of those feelings that we all feel as parents when we're concerned that something's going on with our student, with our kid. But then, of course, what we really come to learn, at least what I came to learn as an educator and also as the mom of a dyslexic child myself, is that, the only way through it, the only way to really persevere is to go through it, and is to embrace ultimately that this is who I am. And that's not a bad thing. It's not something to be ashamed of. In fact, it's something that gives me strength and is powerful. And so that was what really launched the whole experience for me, was just that idea, which felt so important for the students that I work with particularly.
So circling back to, I feel like I sort of didn't exactly ignore Stephen's question, but just touched on it briefly. And I want to apologize and circle back to your question. And that is, yes, we can do all of these things and even more.
Yeah.
Not just combining the writing and the reading and making the writing a response to the reading, but also make the reading about something meaningful like social studies or math or a person from history. And then this other component is, how do we build resilience? And using stories that include stories of resilience, either by writing about your own experiences or by reading stories of resilience. That's a component that we don't talk much about the need for in education, but I believe it's also essential, is to, with everything we do the stories that we choose to share, do all these things.
They do. And they also really, what I have found is they are such an important gateway to social emotional learning as well. That's one of the things that I really saw through the superhero story curriculum, is that it allowed us to talk about social emotional learning through a lens that was accessible to our students. Sometimes and to our teachers, frankly, too, because sometimes it's extremely vulnerable to talk about, social emotional concepts, and yet so critical for our students, maybe now more than ever with what we've gone through this last year with COVID. But when you put it, when you have the lens of a character that you're talking about, so whether you're developing that character or reading about the character, it suddenly becomes just distanced enough that it's much more comfortable to talk about very personal things. And in the case of the stories that we wrote with our students, most of them obviously wrote about their learning disabilities. And so to be able to have just enough distance that it's not, I'm not really talking about me, I'm talking about, you know, Eagle Feather or whatever the name of the character was a really powerful way for kids to feel safe doing that.
Can I just make one very quick comment? As an appreciative inquiry practitioner and a person who has worked in particular in leadership my whole life with girls and women, I am so taken with this evening's conversation because I look at the parallels between story frames and adults telling their stories, but also those skills to be articulate. And as children, when children are learning how to be articulate, how to own their voice and use it, and to organize their thoughts in a way that they will be heard. This is only second for me to critical thinking skills, and they come in together. So I just want to thank you because this was so meaningful, and it touched on so many skills that adults need. And here they are as children learning them.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
There's actually a very interesting chapter in the book by Mary Jo O'Neill, who is a parent advocate. And she works with families to create a story that they then share with the school district to advocate for services for their child. And so this is very much about the child, but from the adult's perspective, and crafting a story for a very specific purpose, which is, this is the story of my child, and this is why my child needs these services.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So Carolee, have you submitted your book? I know it's brand new, but have you submitted your book to the state for potential inclusion on the adopted list as a resource for teachers and other practitioners?
No, but why don't you talk to me afterwards about how to do that? I would love to know.
I will, and I think it's something, if we need to start populating that list, which is a rather tragic list when it comes to reading and writing, with really good materials. And it sounds to me like your approach that you've developed is very research-based. It's based on some sound practice. And if Amy has contributed something, we know her stuff is always like beyond good. And yeah, I know we're the state is going through that process now. I think, Amy, our adoption is next year. I don't know if it's too late, but I'll certainly find out for you. But it would be a good resource for teachers to put on that list, so they don't have to dip into their bank account and buy yet another book. And then, does it come with professional development? If we could get some groups of teachers, perhaps around the state of New Mexico, even if it's a core group, to be led through how to best utilize these materials.
I would be happy to provide professional development, and I have presented on story frames at the IDA conference several times and at ASHA. And so I do have some presentations prepared that I would absolutely be delighted to share.
Excellent. I'll follow up with you later.
Thank you.
Well, I am going to wrap us up because I know that it's dinner time and children's bedtime and soon and all of those other things. But Carolee, really, really fun talking to you. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for initiating the book and for inviting me to be a part of it. It's a real honor to be included. So thank you. And thank you to everybody who's joined us. And if you are interested in purchasing a copy of the book, you can do so through Brooks Publishing, or it's also on Amazon, right? And anywhere else that they can get it?
Yes. Well, and also the bookstore.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, so, and we will be having Collected Works here in Santa Fe. We'll be selling the book in May, and we'll also be selling the titles that Carolee reviews in the book. All of the young adult and children's books will be featured at Collected Works. And they are also lovely enough that if you purchase any of those books and mention the May Center, they're going to give a generous donation to the May Center. A portion of those profits are going to go to the May Center. So really awesome, generous gift that Collected Works is giving us. And there's some great books on the list for summer reading. So it's a good time to be getting them.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for the invitation. This was wonderful.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Everyone have a good evening. Take care.
Bye.